Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're enjoying your fine Tuesday evening. But today I have a wonderful guest, the ever wonderful, elusive, and former recovering journalist, Mr. Auron MacIntyre, on today to discuss recent happenings. I mean, I think unless you live under a rock, you've seen just how crazy things have gotten recently. Many bets have been lost regarding Joe Biden staying in the race as of late, shall we say. But with that introduction out of the way, Mr. Auron, how are you doing today?
Doing well, man. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Good to have you on, Auron. And I think we'll go ahead and get started with the recent revelations around Retard Oswald and his recent phone records being released, actually, that he was in D.C. near a federal office, not surprisingly enough, and that he actually visited that place multiple times before his attempted assassination of Donald Trump on Saturday. And that kind of does paint things in the picture that the right-wing schizophrenics, the right-wing schizos on Twitter may have had a point about Retard Oswald and things not adding up about his attempted assassination and many contradictory statements by the Secret Service and FBI. We see many crazy statements, like the fact that he supposedly walked a mile carrying a 50-foot ladder, AR-15 bags of ammunition, and wasn't stopped. But he didn't have a rangefinder, so he wasn't a threat. I mean, like, what did you think when you saw that headline?
Yeah, obviously there is a lot stacking up that does not look great here. You don't want to spin into conspiracy theories. It's like, I don't need a conspiracy theory here. But at the same time, once you get enough of this evidence together, you have to wonder, is it incredible amounts of incompetence, or at some point does an incredible amount of incompetence equal malice? My working theory, and I had Sean Davis of the Federalist on. We talked about this, and we both kind of came to the conclusion that what we have really is a scenario where the regime certainly wouldn't have been sad to see Donald Trump's head splattered on a television. And so maybe they didn't order this guy. Maybe he doesn't have any unique training, or he wasn't handed all of this, this mission as some element of an intelligence agency. But simply, if you have every one of your media outlets, just spewing Radio Rwanda constantly, hey, this guy is a threat to democracy. He's Hitler. They're coming. They're going to be coming for your rights and everything. This is a existential threat to democracy. If you have this blaring constantly, then eventually someone in your audience is going to take you seriously. And then if you put kind of the D squad on Donald Trump, you deny a bunch of his requests for protection. You make sure that a lot of his agents are, out covering somebody else. They get reassigned. And, you kind of get lax. Then maybe there's a happy accident for you as a Donald Trump hater. You probably didn't directly order this, but you certainly manufactured the situation, which made it relatively likely it would eventually occur.
No, that's very well said. And the media is still trying, as like you and many people have pointed out, they are still trying to get the next, retard Oswald on the assignment. They're actively still trying to do that by, as we've seen famously with the Lincoln Project, calling him Hitler again. Like they are still trying to stoke the fears and trying to get these bio-Leninist products, get one of them on the team again, since they failed obviously on Saturday night. Which who knows what would have happened if things had gone a certain way in that very delicate few seconds that Donald Trump turned his head to look at the teleprompter. But that remains to be seen here.
Yeah, ironically,
Regarding
the future of our country may have been saved in multiple ways by a graph of immigration statistics.
quite
So,
literally, which
yeah,
is so based. You love to
yeah.
see that. Actually, it's a sign from God above. Actually, that divine providence very much is still real and working in our world currently. But I think you made a good point here that like you don't have to have a conspiracy theory here. It's like no, it is just Radio Rwanda, and these people are unhinged and crazy, and as like we see with bio-Leninism. they're spiteful mutants, and quite frankly, they hate nature and reality. You can argue the reasons for that, but like eventually, if you just keep spewing the propaganda, one of them will heed the call to it. You
Yeah,
don't
and
brand conspiracy to do that.
yeah, and I don't want to decry anybody who has a larger machination, type of scenario on display. I'm not saying that's impossible. Like these people really are evil. It's as far as we know, there's no reason to necessarily discredit those things. It's just personally, I lean towards the explanation of that a certain level of malice that comes from ineptitude. You assign the worst people. You make the security as lax as possible. Like you said, you blare that propaganda constantly, and then you just kind of let the chips fall where they may. The numbers are going to run themselves. Eventually, you hit some insane guy who is believing your propaganda on the same day that you have incredibly weak security at a incredibly dangerous public event, and the stars just align for the malicious leftist. But again, I don't decry anybody who thinks that things are more intricate, more pre-planned. I would not put it beyond the people in charge at this point.
No, and you should put nothing past these people. They're evil, as you like you said again. It's not complicated. They're evil and they want to diddle kids. It really is this just that simple. And it's very clear and cogent to the point. But let's move past retard Oswald because he's very unimportant in the long term scheme of things, and let's kind of move on to sort of the main story of the week. And actually, I was working for 8 hours straight, so I kind of missed when this first broke on Twitter and everything. The first kind of news cycle that Biden dropped out of the race, and I'm quite upset about that because I made a bet for $50 that he was going to stay. There's no way that Hunter was going to let his father leave. I mean, like his coke habit is on the line here, so I kind of had that sort of thinking in my mind, and I was proven wrong. And just the way it happens, the most like theater kid, like incompetent late Soviet regime ever. He was just like a statement was just posted on Twitter, and that was it. And he wasn't seen for a couple of days, and then things just kind of spiraled from there. And like there was conspiracy theories that he died. Obviously, those weren't true. We see that he is alive, quote unquote, as live as you can be as a vegetable, as we see. So, Aaron, what do you think about this like palace coup that like happened on Twitter? What does that like show us about the regime and like its state of decay at this point?
Yeah, you end up in this real, late empire hours scenario where you feel like you're reenacting the death of Stalin. No one knows what to do. No one knows what to present to the public. There's all these factions infighting about how things are going to go, who should succeed who, and what's going to be in charge of what. And we spent a lot of our time basically doing this criminology, which is hilarious because that was supposed to be the whole point of kind of the battle between the Soviet Union and the United States is that we had radically different form of government. We had the transparency, we had the democracy, we had the popular sovereignty, and so nothing like this could ever happen in the United States. But what you really recognize is that actually this is just a function of decaying empires, and just as the Soviet Union decayed in its mass managerial empire. Unfortunately, the global American empire is built on a similar structure. We have different trappings. Don't get me wrong. I would much rather live in the United States, even in 2024, than I would in the Soviet Union pretty much at any time. So it's not like there are no differences. There obviously are. But unfortunately, the decay looks very similar. We have a scenario where clearly there are multiple factions inside the left. Joe Biden was chosen because he was really inoffensive. He was a puppet. He would do the bidding of the party. Kamala Harris was placed as his VP for the same reason. She was a DEI hire who was only placed there due to her ability to check boxes, not to lead anything. And however, you ended up in this weird scenario where Joe Biden was supposed to hand off the things to Kamala Harris. He even said, "I'm a transitional president." But then it became very clear that Harris was just a disaster. Like she's not just bad at her job. She's actively just cringe. She's terrible. Every time she speaks, she's just incredibly unlikable. And so the powers that be realized they couldn't kind of go through with the plan. So the idea was maybe we just keep Biden going, even though He kind of shocked people by saying he was going for a second term, even in his current state. And now things have decayed so badly, and especially post the attempted Trump assassination, it's so clear that it would be impossible for Joe Biden to kind of stand against Donald Trump, that they have to do this weird shuffling him off stage. They got to kind of take him out to the corner with the trash, on Sunday afternoon, by just trying to dismiss him with a tweet. But ultimately, Kamala doesn't really seem like a significant improvement. So yeah, the donors finally started donating again. I think she's raised like $200 million or something insane right after this, because they were all withholding the money until Biden would leave. But her poll numbers are already terrible, and it feels like they're only going to get worse once people actually see her out in public again. So it's a real disaster for the left in general. They set up a scenario where they could rule through these puppets, and then when the puppets started kind of falling apart in front of the audience, they don't really know what to do now. They don't have any substantive heir to take over from Biden.
No, and you can just tell the way the managerial state is acting through its like puppets and like pronouncements that like this decision was made weeks ago. Actually, we see this with people like Will Stencil, that cringy Zoomer guy. I forgot what his name is. He's kind of irrelevant. Like how the memo went out, and like all of these people suddenly went from shilling Biden for the past couple of weeks to like instantly becoming a Kamala Harris supporter overnight and like branding the merch, which kind of tells you like this decision was made weeks ago actually, and that like Joe Biden was just told like Saturday night that like, hey, listen, Joe, like we're gonna put you out to pasture now, and like it's going to be a nice retirement for you and your son. You're going to be safe from prosecution, all these things, but we're going to need you to step down now because it's quite clear after the first debate that you're not going to win. And we're going to put Kamala up there, which is the most, you would think, uncogent decision, but I guess in the current state of the Democrat Party and the left, it is the most cogent. Because, again, they still have to abide by their activist base. And that's kind of why Kamala Harris is in there in the first place. And that's the reason Joe put her up there. But like as you said before, Kamala Harris is a total embarrassment who is somehow even less intelligent than the vegetable known as Joe Biden. I mean, like I can just think of that famous statement where she tweeted out where Joe Biden was discussing the Ukraine war, where it was just like this kindergarten almost level explanation of like geopolitics and geography, where it's like Ukraine is a country next to Russia, and Russia invaded Ukraine, and that's bad, democracy good type of thing. And it like here's the scary part about this: as much as we want to make fun of her, and we should, because obviously she's the most she's the most like successful nominee the left has at this point. I guess that's showing something about the state of our enemies, that like they legitimately are incompetent, and like this is the best they got. But like where's like she legitimately does have a chance at winning. Like legitimately, when you look at the state of things and the again the great replacement and all these other things the left has had going on for like 80 plus years at this point, and like the total like regime media narrative control that the left has, like they very much stood kill turn this around in her favor, and that's really showing something about the state of the empire and the American people in a
Yeah,
broader sense.
yeah. In a just a purely political analysis, just looking at her favorability, the way that she plays to an audience, her public persona compared to Trump's momentum, it should be a slam dunk. But you're right to say that you can't just sit on your laurels here, because we've already seen that the progressive machine is very powerful. They subscribe to machine politics in a way that the right just has failed to do, and we continue to pay a deep cost for that. And so the minute that they kind of spool this thing up, once they've got the funding, once they got the people in place, it really becomes a matter of, ballots determine these things, not polls. So all the good polls in Trump's favor don't actually matter if the left harvests enough ballots. However you think that gets done, YouTube, that's a reality. And so I think that it's going to be very difficult if there's a wide gap there is a certain level of too big to rig that is true, right? There's a difference between trying to manufacture 3 points one way or another in an election and trying to manufacture 10. And if you try to take something that is clearly a blowout and turn it into a win in Kamala Harris's favor in front of the entire nation, again, you really do risk, pushing things to the level of, places the left would rather not go. Thing Politics breaking down very quickly into real life scenarios. And so I think that it would be wise for them if they cannot get her with a certain percentage points to not attempt this. But as you say, these people are so unhinged that you can't really factor wisdom into this. You can't assume that rational decisions are going to rule the day when it comes to how the left are going to play this. If they were smart, they would recognize that Trump's probably going to win this by too much. You just kind of run Kamala out, recognize she was a disaster anyway, let her, take her shot so that next time you can run a far more suitable replacement. But I don't know if the left's going to be able to do that. You can't spend all this time pretending that Donald Trump is going to end the world and then just let him waltz in, especially over the first black female candidate. That there is a certain level of commitment that if they don't make to Kamala Harris's candidacy, will show themselves to their constituents as being entirely fake.
No, and that definitely is a factor that kind of like binds the left. Like as we said before, the woke is not going to be put away. Like as much as like certain people on the dissident right want to make bets about
I've got a whole cigar writing on that fact. Yeah.
Exactly, and I take your side in this. I take your side in this wager, because again, like the machine, it's a race to the bottom, and like as things progress, like again, the left is entropy. It inevitably like degrades, rots societies, and so it must become more and more and more and more unhinged. And like yes, like certain elements of the regime, like some of the more smarter people in the State Department, do want to tamper some of the more extreme elements of the woke. However, the question at the end of the day is like, are they actually powerful enough and competent enough, number two, to like tamper down on their activists and like just like the sheer like lunacy of these like spiteful mutants that the left has like bred over like 80 plus years of continuous revolution. And like as we've seen with this recent assassination attempt, I don't believe that they're competent enough or the will is there to put the woke away. And so that's why the left just can't have Kamala step down and they put somebody more competent like a Josh Shapiro or even like a Gavin Newsom, who I despise for many vehemently reasons. But who you can legitimately argue is a more smart and rational actor compared to Kamala. They just can't do that. And that is something that kind of binds the left, and that is a weakness. However, also we need to keep in mind, they hold our country hostage. It's like our good friend Pete Quinona says. They may be a giant, like 40-foot baby, but they have a chainsaw. So you need to treat them like a dangerous threat because they are. Even though they're insane, they're unhinged, they're not smart, they're becoming more and more incompetent, as we've seen recently with this like palace coup. Like these people legitimately are dangerous, though. We need to always keep that in mind and never underestimate these people.
Yeah, the ideological commitments that the left has made to bind their coalition does limit their range of action. They're willing to throw these ideological commitments under the bus whenever possible, but there are some core ones that are necessary. And there's only so many times that you can tell, for instance, the base that you are committed to putting a black woman in office and then just skip over for like a nice white guy like Gavin Newsom. They might want to do that, but they simply are not able to because of the way they've structured themselves. They couldn't have handed that money over. They couldn't have made the swap the same way that they did. And so that really does back them into a certain corner. But like you said, the problem is that even if it's a wounded animal is still dangerous, especially when it has the claws that are attached to several aircraft carrier groups, like the United States government does. And so while you're right to point out that these people are inept and they are degenerating in their competency levels and they are signed on to these ideologies, you're also correct to point out that we should not treat them as if they are harmless, or as if because they have succumbed to certain contradictions inside their coalition, that all of a sudden means that we're victorious and we don't need to worry about these things. They really do, in many ways, still hold a gun to the head of a lot of Americans. They still have the ability to destroy the lives of many Americans. And so, really, threading the needle here is finding the way in which the Democratic Party's power can collapse without them, taking a broad swipe at as many heritage Americans as possible.
No, and to kind of like circle back to earlier in the discussion, like there is a certain point where like the regime and like the deep state, whatever you want to call it, there's many names for it. Liberal hegemony is another one I like to call it, where you can't just like install a vegetable and then declare him the winner. Like COVID was like for many reasons, good or bad, an unprecedented like circumstance. And that doesn't mean they're not going to try again. They certainly will because they were successful in 2020. However, we need to keep in mind that like the way the managerial regime like showed itself with COVID was very unprecedented in the modern age. This is something you would have like never seen with like Bush Senior, the Clintons, like when the deep state was very much a competent and cogent animal, and actually a very much more dangerous animal than it is right now in some ways, where the regime will lose so much legitimacy and it becomes so obvious when they install just absolute like to put in like simple terms, a kindergarten teacher like Kamala Harris, obviously, to where like if they just declare her the winner and it's quite obvious if they do things like we're still counting the ballots a week later, that's probably not going to slide. And we need to keep in mind these people are foxes, they're not lions. They're not great at using force. And that doesn't mean that like we have this in the bag. That doesn't mean like the great like MAGA chuds are going to revolt in some sense, but like that is a like crippling blow to the regime's like legitimacy and like belief in the narrative, like the post-boomer World War truth like narrative about America, that will essentially destroy its credibility and like quite torpedo the project of the American global empire in short order if they try to do something like that in 2024.
Yeah, there is a diminishing returns, and a lot of the guys who are online and familiar with everything that's happened look at what's going on and say, how could the regime have any more credibility? How could normies not recognize what's going on? How could the things be any more obvious? But this is why I try to tell people, like, you need to do Walmart politics. Like, theory's great. Obviously, I've dedicated my show and my book and a lot of my work to working on political theory, and that's important. But you should also talk to people at Walmart so that you get a real frame for what the actual opinion of the average American is, rather than just believing that kind of your extremely online experience.
I think he cut out for a second there. But I think what Mr. Aaron was trying to bring up at this point was that like everything is, we're not all like autistic theory cells on Twitter who have read like Nietzsche, Avila, and all these other obscure books that like 5 people have read. The average normie. Oh, sorry, you're back, Mr. Aaron.
Oh, did I cut out there?
Yeah, you cut out for a second.
Oh, okay, sorry. But yeah, I was just saying, like, the story is falling apart for a lot of these people, but they still don't recognize everything that's going on. And when there's more and more damage to these things, these storylines, it does help to reveal what's happening. So that's the value of Trump. That's the value of the cycle we're going through now. Is the left is just very interested in destroying him at all costs, and so they will go ahead and shred whatever credibility they had left to do this. I don't know if they recognize how close they are to teetering on the edge, but the fact that they basically tried to eliminate both uh, presidential candidates, one through assassination and one through bumping him off the ballot, and successfully got one of them off, really kind of shows you how desperate they are.
No, and it kind of like also brings back a Curtis Yarvin point where like I know this is an old like trite NRX point, but it's still very cogent in our age. Like when you like see the cathedral doing stuff like this out in the open, like you see it like peeking through the kabuki theater, as we like to say, like that is a legitimate sign that like it is actually the machine is breaking down. When it has to do stuff like this in the open, where they have to coup like their own vegetable on Twitter, just because he's so coherent that they're scared they're going to lose an election to Donald Trump again. Like this stuff really does show you like the regime is very much. Don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean like the future belongs to us and then we don't have to like fight or do anything. That's not my point here. My point is just telling us that like the regime is not as competent as an animal as it was in the 80s or 90s or even early 2000s under Bush. Like that regime, that old American empire that could like do Waco and like competently like explain that to the American people in a way that wouldn't arouse any too many actions, type of thing. That state doesn't exist anymore. Like all the people, all the cogs who are necessary to run that complex machine, white men and Asians, to a lesser extent, have been excluded essentially by progressive race politics, and they're not allowed. And so you only get just like the worst bio-Leninist people who are allowed in the regime, because those are the only people who are still loyal to the progressive religion, as we like to call it. And
Yeah,
so as a like consequence of that, things just begin breaking down and they can't do things like they did before.
yeah, in a lot of ways, that's scarier to people, right? Because evil competence would still be preferable for a lot of people to just kind of checked out incompetence. It's like the Joker line from I think it's the Dark Knight Returns. You know, everybody wants a plan, even if it's a terrible plan, even if the plan is everybody dies. They just prefer a plan. But the minute there's no plan, that's when people really panic. And we're in the scenario where I think a lot of people, even on the right, we're assuming that the expert class, the managerial class, we're going to be able to turn this ship around. That ultimately the elites are still adults. They're there for a reason. They hold the power for a reason. And they're going to be able to turn the ship around. I understand this from my buddy AA. You know, academic agent believes that ultimately power is there in charge because they are the ones that are competent. They're the ones that were organized and they're the ones that are ruling. And in a lot of cases, of course, he's right. I'm an elite theorist myself. So I agree with a lot of that. But what he's kind of failed to understand is what you pointed out, that so much of the regime has been swapped out, both ideologically and just through identity politics, that there's very few people that can operate these things anymore. And that puts us in a very scary scenario because the people in charge are both evil and incompetent. And so the again, threading that needle is really finding a way to siphon as much power away from these guys as possible, without kind of triggering their defense mechanism to try to drop the hammer on a lot of people. Which is why I think guys like Ron DeSantis in Florida are so critical, because you really want to go ahead and transfer as much power away from Leviathan as possible, so that these guys don't have those giant claws when they're thrashing around in their death throes.
Yes, you want to have some based and competent people at the local and state level, which, as we've seen increasingly, does legitimately matter after the COVID pandemic, in quotation marks, where we saw that, like, even in red states, a lot of these governors, state legislators complied with the dictates from DC and the World Health Organization, and they shut down churches. They barred you from going to picnics. They even arrested you if you tried to do such things with your family. And people tolerated that. And I think that kind of did produce an awakening, as you say in your book, actually, where people did see, oh, wait, we don't live in this like free American state where everything is great. Like, the George Washington, sort of like post-revolutionary idealist America anymore. We live in something very much different. That is, you're very much not free. You very much think you're free because you have all of these distractions and vices and addictions the machine can feed to you to keep you weak and like pacified. But you're very much less free. You're not allowed to say things. You're not allowed to question why the regime is increasingly like targeting you and like very much has a ickling against red Americans and wants you destroyed and killed and your kid's trans. Like, these things are very much becoming obvious. And people like DeSantis, like, some of these like other Christian nationalists who have like claimed power in local politics, these people are very much necessary because like as the machine thrashes and becomes less competent just due to entropy alone, like we can actually, this is an opportunity for us to claim more and more autonomy and state power from like the centralized machine in DC. And that's what like people like Ron DeSantis and other red state governors are trying to reclaim, and like some of these other base people and red state legislators are trying to bring back that idea of like, before, Abraham Lincoln defeated the Confederate States in the Civil War, the United States was known as these United States and not the United States. That transition occurred after the Confederate States were deleted. And that idea that like, no, very much these states in the Union are very much their own like autonomous units, and they're very much in a serious and like coherent way, instead of a singular unit to be run out of DC. And these people are necessary to sort of revive that idea and reclaim power. And I very much see that as a promising avenue for us in the future.
Yeah, I have to head out here in just a second, but before I go, I just want to say that you're right. And in my book, yeah, again, I spent a lot of time the last chapter to explaining that really it is the structure as we have it now, the social organization we have, inevitably brings us to kind of the total state that we're seeing, the kind of the progressive devolution of the United States as we understand it. And the only way to fix that is to go ahead and focus on those local and state levels. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be pushing for victory at the national level. It doesn't mean that hopefully if Donald Trump wins, he can't make significant strides in certain areas like immigration or dismantling certain parts of the deep state. But ultimately, in order to return ourselves to the place where we can go ahead and build communities of like mind and and have that kind of shared moral vision, religious vision, that history and heritage, to do that stuff, we have to return things to a local level. You simply cannot build that in in an empire that spans multiple continents. And that doesn't mean that maybe perhaps the United States as a political entity has to dissolve itself, but it does mean that we have to turn to a much more radical version of federalism, something much closer to, as you say, the founders' original intention, which is that while we as a country might work together in certain instances, the states themselves really are their own little nations, their own tribes that are building their own cultures, building their own folkways, living their own lives. And that allows us to have a place where multiple, peoples can still exist inside a shared political entity, but they can have distinct futures that allow them to favor their own ways of life.
That's very well said, Mr. Auron MacIntyre, and I really appreciate you joining us, and I really greatly enjoyed this conversation. Is there anything you kind of like would like to shield our audience or let you know that you're working on currently?
Just the classics, got the book out. So if you haven't bought the Total State, you can get that on Amazon or any of the major bookstores, or order it at your local bookstore. And then, of course, all of my stuff appears on The Blaze. I've got a new column I'm working on right now, should be out tomorrow. So people want to check that out. Of course, you can subscribe to the podcast or the YouTube channel as well.
Thank you, and I definitely recommend that everybody in my audience check that stuff out. Auron is the Boomer Whisperer for a reason, and he does his job very well.
Well, thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and I appreciate you having me on. Have a good rest of your day, man.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I really appreciated Mr. Auron for joining us for that short conversation. It was very great, and I hope that kind of enlightened everyone to some of the more interesting happenings from a elite perspective that is high IQ. As I like to say, we only have high IQ people on my channel for a reason, and it's so base. But if you guys do have any questions, please type them in the chat. I will be staying for a couple extra minutes before I have to, unfortunately, leave for this afternoon. But if you do have any questions, just at me, and I will be happy to answer them, paid or unpaid. I am happy to do that. And it looks like we do have one question in here from Mr. Javier Olvia. This may be nothing, but why are federal departments called directorates? Directorate sounds Soviet. Well, Mr. Olivier, I think that's because actually that's a French revolutionary idea from the French word directory. A lot of like the ideas that some of these people that inspired the revolution, actually some of these Jeffersonian and Benjamin Franklin ideas who wrote the Constitution and like kind of set up the three branches of government. A lot of their inspirations did come from revolutionary France and liberal philosophers such as Voltaire, who did have the notion of a popular will and like how to divide government in a sense from more of the classical idea of absolute monarchies. So I believe it's just taking inspiration from some of the more classical liberal thinkers from England, France, and Germany and such. I don't think it's doesn't have anything to do with the Soviets, as far as I know. All right, well, since there is I'm going to give it a couple more minutes. If there isn't any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and leave for this afternoon. But I greatly appreciate you all joining me for this conversation, and if you did enjoy it, please consider giving my channel a like and subscribe. It's always appreciated. But yes, things are very much happening. Nothing ever happens has been proven wrong very much since this year very much began. It's been quite a lot. I mean, let's just like recap where we've been so far. We've had Jews coming out of the sewer in New York City. We've had a palace coup with Joe Biden, an attempted assassination with Donald Trump, war in the Middle East continuing. That's also continuing to be escalating right now, actually. Interesting developments with China, the collapse of the American empire as we see currently. So yes, like very much history is very much still happening, is very much a real concept, and we see it as the zeitgeist continues to flow right now. And I'm very much excited to see where it takes us all. But yes, I don't see any more questions, so I am going to go ahead and end the stream today. But I do wish you all a wonderful and happy afternoon. Thank you all for joining me.